Our last chapter in this public speaking unit is on persuasion. Now you have a good understanding about how to inform. Let's dive into the world of persuasion. There are a lot of different aspects to persuasion. So some of the things you're going to be learning are about persuasion in general, or how you'd use persuasion in other possible scenarios. The speeches that we are doing in this class are what I would call non-traditional persuasive speeches. They are more fun, lighthearted. So keep that in mind. You're learning about persuasion in general. Some of these concepts will specifically be used in your speeches. Other concepts will not necessarily be used in your speeches in this class, but it's important information to know. So persuasive is divided up into 3 videos. This first part, we're going to cover the definition, how to create propositions, organization of ideas and main points, and audiences. Then on the subsequent videos, we'll dive into persuasive strategies, Aristotle's ethos, pathos, and logos, and how to use those. So persuasion is the process of attempting to change or reinforce listeners' attitudes, beliefs, values, or behaviors. It is not bashing. Or I think there's some misconceptions of how to be appropriate and how to argue appropriately and effectively. And there's not a lot of great examples in our society on appropriate motivation or persuasion. And so we're going to look at some ways to influence or change attitudes, beliefs, values, or behaviors. And I'll define those here in a few moments. Coercion is using unethical force to get another person to think or behave as you wish. And that is an unethical approach. It is using force, and it's taking away your choice. So it doesn't really then fit in persuasion when you are forced into something. And so we are working through wanting to make sure that we are being persuasive and not coercive. I think you can probably think of some examples of coercion in our life today. So persuasion is all about influencing others, and we're influencing others in our groups and in life in general. We're always affecting others. And so when it comes to persuasion, we're trying to either influence or change attitudes, beliefs, values, and or behaviors. And these will all be aspects to consider in your speeches in this class. So attitudes are the evaluations that we make of people, object, ideas, or how we lean or we have predispositions to feel positively or negatively about an idea. And so that's all about your sort of your perspective. We might have receive a piece of criticism and it leads to a negative attitude. Attitudes are the easiest to change of all of these. So that gives you a little bit. Sometimes happy hour is also known as attitude adjustment hour. Not that I'm advocating that, but it's fairly easy to change somebody's attitudes. Beliefs are how people perceive reality, what we believe to be true, even though you may not be able to prove that it's true, right? Those are more ingrained in you, and those are a little bit more difficult to change than an attitude. Values, those are enduring conceptions of what's right or wrong, good or bad, the principles that a person holds as important, your value system. Oftentimes it's influences come from your culture or your religious upbringing or political upbringing, but those are more ingrained in you and much more difficult to change. Like, you won't change anybody's value systems in a short speech. That wouldn't be our goal. Maybe trying to get them to reevaluate their values, that might be a good challenge. Behaviors, how people act or function, right? How they act upon influences. And we justify our behaviors based on our attitudes, beliefs, and our values. Some people would argue that behaviors are very easy to change, and others would argue very difficult. And so I guess it depends maybe on what the subject is. We know that it's illegal to text and drive, and a lot of you do it anyway. And so trying to get you not to do that, or drinking and driving, or other things like that, it's not so easy to change people's behaviors, although it's certainly a great goal. And anytime you're wanting to create change, making it easy on the person is a great way to start. When you're persuading, this is just sort of the perspective behind it. A persuasive speaker invites the listener to make a choice rather than just offering information. And so you can offer the information, but then you request or challenge and have I need you to decide, make a choice, stand up, do this, do that. We are wanting to be very detailed and descriptive in telling our audience. We're not hiding, we're not beating around the bush, we're not hinting it. We're very clear as a speaker of what we're asking of you as a listener. They ask you to respond thoughtfully. Sometimes it's okay to say, hey, I know that some of you may not have thoroughly researched this. You may have a differing opinion than I do, but I would challenge you to listen carefully, respond thoughtfully to the information I'm going to give you today. You might learn something new that you didn't know before. Something like that. And then the persuasive speaker is intentionally trying to change or reinforce their feelings, ideas, or behaviors. And so you need to be clear in your introductions of any persuasive speech of what you're trying to convince them of. Right? I want you to recycle appropriately. Right? You want to be clear and upfront. I want you to start eating a more healthy diet, an organic diet. Those would be more clear intentions. We're not hiding. You're upfront about what you're trying to do. Typically, there are a couple of different types of persuasive speeches to convince. Form a new belief, change a previous belief, and to speeches to actuate. Continue a behavior, discontinue a behavior, or start a new one. And so traditionally, persuasive speeches fall into one of those two categories. In our class, we are doing either motivational, inspirational quotes, or we're doing commercials. And so if you're trying to sell us something, you might be convincing us and actuating by asking us to buy your product. If you're trying to motivate us, inspire us with a quote, then you might be trying to convince us that the quote is true and then have us start changing or thinking differently, asking us to change or do something. When it comes to persuasion, a thesis, which you would normally have like in your informative speech, is now actually called a proposition. And so we're going to talk about that. But oftentimes your persuasive speeches are more controversial in nature and sometimes challenging them to hear a different perspective. And so while we're not doing controversial issues in this class, you should be equipped with how to approach that. And you would still be clear in your introduction of what you're trying to convince them of. I do recommend opposing viewpoint database for all things persuasive. We are having a written persuasive assignment that I'm asking you to use the opposing viewpoint database in or with, and always understand what the type of persuasive speech is, because as I said, there are different types. And so don't assume you know what we're doing. Always make sure you're clear. So a persuasive thesis is called a proposition, and there's actually three types: a proposition of fact, value, and policy. So your proposition is, what are you arguing? And it's a simple, clear statement. right? It could be a proposition of fact, so you're arguing that something is true or it's false. It could be a proposition of value, which is judging the worth or the importance of something, like quality control, good, better, right? Good, bad, right, wrong. This is better than that. Those would be positions of value or propositions of value. And then propositions of policy are all about action, taking action, changing policy, procedures, buying products, changing behaviors. So your persuasive thesis, now a proposition, would be written depending on whether you're arguing that something is true, false, good, bad, right or wrong, or a proposition of policy. You want to argue that Coke is better than Pepsi, that would be a proposition of value. Okay. So you have some examples in your text that will also help you with this. So you will be creating a persuasive thesis or a proposition in your speeches. Persuasive speeches are organized differently than your informative. So while you learn some great techniques in informative speaking, those are different. And you need to have an organizational pattern in order for your speech to be sound persuasive. So you'll check out your book. There's problem solutions, statements of logical reasons, there's Monroe's motivated sequence, and that's what you're going to use to structure your speech, is an persuasive organizational pattern. So you have some examples in your text, and you can check those out when you decide which type of speech you'd like to do. The last thing you're just going to learn a little bit about is your audience. You always need to try to understand your audience. We learned about audience analysis previously. But when it comes to persuasion, it gets a little bit more detailed. So you're going to find a couple of things in your chapter. Social judgment theory is discussed, and basically it tells us that there's many positions on an issue. It's not necessarily just for or against, or agree or disagree. Here we have strongly agree, no opinion, or sometimes that's neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And you need to have the right perspective for your audience. If somebody strongly disagrees with you, it's unrealistic to assume by the end of your speech they're going to strongly agree. Your goal would be to move them somewhere along the continuum to less strongly disagree with you. So keep in mind, there's a lot of positions on the issue. In the center, I think there's two. I think there's people that don't know the subject, so they don't have an opinion. And I think there are people that maybe understand the issue, but are neutral about it. So that could be something you would want to decipher. Ego is involved with your audience, and if somebody has a really strong ego, their position on an issue is tied into their identity, and the more ego is involved, the more resistant that person will be. You're also introduced to the elaboration likelihood model, or ELM, and it's how listeners process persuasive messages, either by the importance or the relevance. So you're going to learn about central and peripheral processing, and that's another way to help you understand how your audience thinks. And then we always adapt our information in our speeches to what we think the audience might be feeling. When it comes to audience dispositions, their attitudes, there are receptive audiences, neutral audiences, and unreceptive audiences. And there are specific tips that can help you with how do you address a receptive audience? How do you address a neutral audience or an unreceptive audience? And so these are always good to know when putting together maybe a speech that is controversial and people in your audience disagree with you. You would want to come back and utilize some of these tips. Now, because we're doing more fun, lighthearted speeches, we are doing commercials or inspirational quotes, don't assume that you have an unreceptive audience. You probably have a receptive or a neutral audience. Okay. So now you have a little better understanding about persuasion, a proposition, organizational patterns, and a little bit more about audience analysis. We're diving in deeper, and we're adapting our material in thinking about our audience. I have more tips in the actual assignments that you can check out, especially when it comes to sales or commercials. And so I do provide you with some extra tips. So the next two videos are going to cover Aristotle's ethos, pathos, and logos, and how to avoid fallacies and conclusions.